Today we are joined by Hussein Askari. It's a real pleasure to have Hussein join us because Hussein not only is the Vice President of the Belt and Road Institute of Sweden, with an extensive background in economic development thinking and policy development, but from our point of view, Hussein brings a unique perspective on probably the hottest of hotspots in the world today. And I'm talking, of course, about the conflict between Iran and Israel and the recent bombings of Iran by the United States. Hussein is from Iraq originally, has many family still within the region. Thankfully, they are safe, he told me, and maintains a depth of understanding of what's going on in that neck of the woods. Welcome to the show, Hussein.
Thank you very much, Warwick. Thank you for the introduction. It is my pleasure to be with the Taihe Institute. I'm a survivor of 3 wars. Since I was a little kid, we had a civil war in Iraq between the Kurdish and Iraqi army. I was in the northern Iraq. I survived the Iran-Iraq war, 8 years, and then the Gulf War, the Kuwait War. And after that, I left Iraq. I have been living in Europe for the last more than 30 years. And I have been working as an economic and strategic analyst for this around this region. I claim to know a bit of the situation.
Look, you mentioned the fact that you are the survivor of 3 wars, and I think this is probably a very good angle, if you will, to dive into the events of today. As many people will know, President Trump unilaterally announced a ceasefire. There have been some issues already in relation to whether or not the ceasefire has held. Perhaps you can quickly give us an update on where things are at. We are, of course, speaking at the tail end in Australia anyway of Tuesday, the 24th of June. But give us a quick snapshot of where things are at as you understand it, but more importantly, put this whole question into some historical context.
Yes, what we saw yesterday with the Iranian bombing of the Udeid military base, the American base in Qatar, and the non-reaction from that immediately President Trump declares that now there is peace and a ceasefire. This was like absurd theater, the theater of the absurd. This is beyond George Orwell. I mean, I used to read a lot of Samuel Beckett and Kafka and that stuff. This is even more absurd because the idea of peace, war, everything is mixed up and upside down. It makes no sense at all. The original, of course, this whole issue goes very, very long back in history. We can even start in 1917. And even before that. But the issue now is with this so-called ceasefire, which is not really a ceasefire. It is a declaration by President Trump, whom nobody is actually trusts. He lost all credibility. But even hopefully that there will be no shooting, I don't know if we can call that ceasefire, it does not solve the root causes of the problem. And the root causes of the problem are multiple, but there are smaller reasons and bigger reasons. The real big reason, the root cause, the underlying cause for all of this is that we have had a global system, a world order, the unipolar world order. It's become old, it has become obsolete, but also dangerous. It does not want to concede its position as the ruler of the world, and that is the power of the United States, Britain, and their allies, the so-called Five Eyes, and some countries in the EU and NATO. They don't want to accept the fact that their order, their system is collapsing. They are sitting on a huge pile of toxic financial paper and debt. The physical economy of the United States and the EU is degenerating. The infrastructure, the manufacturing, the education, the healthcare, many of these aspects in the West are degenerating. At the same time, we have the rise of China, East Asia, Southeast Asia, and generally the global South. And they want to have a different kind of order, not to replace the West, but to coexist with the West, but on completely new basis, on equality, economic justice, and sovereignty. What was done to Iran now, and this is one of the real issues here, is that since 9/11 at least, but even before that, with the bombing of Yugoslavia in 1990s, like Tony Blair expressed it very well. He said that there is a system of Westphalian peace, that nations are sovereign and independent, is obsolete. It doesn't exist anymore. We decide, we, the civilized world, the free world, we decide how nations will live and which leaders they will have. And we saw this happening in Iraq, and then later in Libya, Syria, and so on and so forth. Afghanistan, of course, is a very another case. But we have this system which is not able to control anything, but it's just spreading chaos and refusing to concede to the rising economic and political power of other nations who want equality and justice. They don't want to have hegemony. Now, on the lower level, we have the Israeli policy. We know this very well from the Benjamin Netanyahu. He has been in power for like 2 decades now. And the policy which he and the neoconservatives in the United States share, which is what he wrote an article together with one of the Richard Pearl, another neocon from the United States. It's called Clean Break, a strategy to secure the realm. This was in 1996. And this came a few months after the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by right-wing Israeli extremists of the same camp as Netanyahu himself. These were the people who accused Rabin of being a traitor to Israel. Now, this whole thing, the whole peace process, or the Oslo peace process, was derailed with that. And then we had all kinds of terrorist acts being committed by different groups, Palestinian groups and other groups. And then with retaliation, Yasser Arafat was sidelined. And we had this snowballing of the collapse of the whole peace process continuing. Now, the idea behind the clean break, Netanyahu's policy, and the neocons, who are not really the ones who control American policy, they control part of the policy. I don't buy this theory that the Zionists control the United States and the world. That's not true. The Zionists, since the inception of the Zionist movement, its conception by the British monarchy in the 19th century, it has been a tool of British and American geopolitics. They are a tool. So the idea is that Israel will be a destabilizing factor in this region to maintain the control of the Anglo-American or transatlantic financial, economic, military hegemony. That's the tool. And therefore, the idea was that Israel will become the dominant military and political power in the region, where you have big nations like Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and so on. They must be undermined. They must be destroyed to a certain extent. And unfortunately, they have managed to do a lot of that recently, but not by the might of Israel, but by the might of the Anglo-American military power and intelligence and economic sanctions and so on. So on the lower level, Israel is the big problem here. And of course, this recent development started with Israel violating international law, committing a war crime by attacking, invading, and bombing a sovereign nation. This is a war crime and a violation of the United Nations Charter. The United States came into it. So this whole idea, which is the reason I say we are not going to have peace because of this ceasefire is because the axioms, the ideas that govern the thinking in the West and in Israel are not changed. Unless you change the axioms, you will not be able to change the actions. Yitzhak Rabin said it, actually. He said, we have to accept that we have to change our axioms, which he meant that we should not consider the Arabs and Palestinians as subhuman. We should accept them as equal. We should accept the fact that there will be a Palestinian state here next to us and that we live as equals among all the Arab countries. This is what he meant by changing the axioms, that you get away from this supremacy idea, that you are special, you are superior to others. and others are like a lower category of humans. And this is not changed. That's what I see as the problem here. That the United States, if you listen to Vice President J.D. Vance yesterday declaring the ceasefire and the great success, the way he talked about the Iranians is like, it's a jungle. The only reason the Iranians will not attack us is because we can hit them on the head anytime we want. This is not a way of first dealing with other human beings and not a way of achieving peace. There is no idea of diplomacy. There's only that we have the B-2 bombers. They can bomb Iran anytime. And the only reason the Iranians will behave is because we can beat them. This is not how you treat other humans. This is not how you treat other nations. And the rest of the world is taking note of that this is the philosophy which is governing the American elite. This is the philosophy which is governing Israel. And many nations are weary. Actually, if Iran goes down, you will have Pakistan next, Egypt. And then, of course, we have had people speaking for many years about dismantling the Russian Federation, that after we finish with Iran and Pakistan, all these, we will dismantle the Russian Federation into ethnic and different groups. So we can weaken Russia, divide it into smaller and smaller states, and then finally we can focus on China. This have been said by people in think tanks and governments in the West for a long time. And this is total madness, because with the thermonuclear weapons, nobody can achieve such goals. And the Russians made it very clear, if there is an existential threat to their existence as a nation, they will not hesitate to use thermonuclear weapons, which means the end of civilization. So this is what worries me, is that the people who talk about achieving a ceasefire and peace, like Trump, their axioms, their ideas about themselves, about society, about human beings and nature is quite, absurd. And this is where the source of my fear is, that we will not have peace in this region for a long time.
One of the dimensions of this is an expectation, as you described, that that the mere threat of being able to club someone over the head is sufficient to modify their behaviour. That clearly hasn't played out. It would seem to me, observing from afar, that the initial attack on Iran by Israel was expected to deliver some kind of a shock and awe effect, and ultimately lead to a cascading collapse of the government in Iran. Now, that doesn't seem to have happened, firstly. And secondly, it seems that the Iranians have sufficient, not just willpower and determination, but material means to respond, and do so in a way that has demonstrated that the much vaunted Israeli military machine, backed by the United States with a impenetrable Iron Dome, is actually anything but that. Do you think that that reality ultimately led to the United States calculating that they had to act to, in a sense, change the dynamics of the conflict?
Yes, I think there are military, experts, people who have a more calculating way of looking at reality, physical reality, not ideology, and they look at the warehouses of these anti-missile, systems, and also the depletion of the industrial and manufacturing power in the United States and the EU and the NATO countries, which I described earlier, is affecting their ability to wage wars or defend themselves against new types of weapons, like the Iranian hypersonic weapons. So the depletion of Israel's arsenal of anti-missile systems, and also you can imagine, if the Iran continues to attack American bases, their ability to defend themselves will also diminish. And therefore now, Israel controls the airspace of Iran, because Iran does not have efficient anti aircraft systems to defend it. But Israel is as exposed as Iran because Iran has developed new types of weapons where they can, with precision, attack anywhere in Israel. And therefore, it must have been a realistic understanding that you cannot win this war if it continues for a few weeks more. And also, the issue is like, what is victory? I mean, people don't really understand. The United States waged all these wars. Look at Afghanistan. 20 years in Afghanistan, and NATO and the United States, with all their technology, all their weapons, they did not manage to win that war. Isn't that absurd? The United States, as one Pentagon analyst said, the United States spent the equivalent of 10 Belt and Road initiatives in Afghanistan without building one single road, and 6 Belt and Roads in Iraq. And did the United States win? No. So the idea of victory is really perverted here, because you neither achieve peace, nor prosperity, nor security. And this is where people have to really think, about the philosophy of waging war and fighting wars. What is the goal behind it? And this is something people don't get. But the military people who work on the nuts and bolts of the military equipment, they have probably told President Trump, look, we can't continue this.
Yeah, there is always an irony that it's often the people who are charged with waging war, they're actually the ones who are most reluctant to wage war, being fully aware of, firstly, the consequences of warfare, and of course the real life difficulties of actually achieving what somebody might describe as a win. One of the big issues in all of this, at least on the surface of things, is this idea of the Iranian nuclear program, and the argument that the nuclear program had reached a point where it posed a threat to at least Israel, and via that, an extension of the argument is to regional security. It seems, though, that the bombing of the various facilities looks like it hasn't delivered the results that was originally claimed, namely the destruction of the Iranian nuclear program, but perhaps worse. And I touch on your word, which you've used on a few occasions in this discussion, perverse. That it seems perverse that the objective of destroying this potential nuclear threat, so the claim goes, may actually lead to the acceleration of the realization of this threat, but no longer under the gaze of international observers, but in some secret location that nobody knows about. What do you, I guess, know of where this situation is at, and what are your thoughts on the future of the Iranian nuclear program?
Yeah, well, I think one of the issues which is really irritating is that, look at the enormous level of ignorance of the Vice President of the United States, because he keeps talking about obliterating the nuclear program of Iran. Now, which program of the two? The civilian nuclear program, which is a legitimate right of every nation to have civilian nuclear technology for their economy, for their progress, for their scientific and technological progress? Or are you talking about something else? Now, this leads me to believe that what I mentioned earlier, what Tony Blair said, that there is no sovereignty and independence for nations. We decide what they have and what they... By the way, Tony Blair delayed the negotiations to reach an agreement with Iran for many years, because as head of the EU in 2005, he told the EU, look, the Iranians don't really need nuclear power. They have so much oil and gas. We can help them develop their oil and gas like the Gulf countries, so they don't need nuclear power. And the Iranian president, Hassan Rouhani, wrote a whole book, because he was the main negotiator as national security advisor. He wrote a whole book how the British sabotage every time they tried to reach an agreement with. That's why it took 7 years to reach the JPCOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. That plan was the best guarantee that that Iran never is capable of building a nuclear bomb, because you had international observers and cameras everywhere in the Iranian facilities. So that was the best guarantee. And the agreement was reached in 2015. What did Trump do? As soon as he came in, he canceled the United States participation in it. And then the European partners, in a cowardly manner, they also withdrew because they had given Iran guarantees that they will not withdraw because this is a great agreement. So the idea is, on a certain way, that they really want to destroy Iran as a nation, as an independent sovereign nation with scientific, technological, and economic capabilities. That's what I believe is the real reason they want to attack Iran. It's not because Iran. Look, 3 weeks ago, the director of intelligence of the United States, Tulsi Gabbard, told Congress that the joint assessment of all the American intelligence agencies is that Iran is not in the process of building a nuclear bomb. This has been the assessment since 2007, I think. Every year, the American intelligence community issue a report of the threats, and every time they say Iran does not have, is not building a bomb. But they don't really care about the Iranian nuclear bomb threat because they know it didn't exist. But now, as you say, not only Iran, many other nations say, look, if we don't have a nuclear bomb, we will be attacked. And this is really a destruction of the international, governance system, because we enter into a really, really dangerous area. And this is what really is behind. So Iran, in the nuclear program, Iran has all the right to have a civilian nuclear program. Iran is a very advanced nation. I travel to Iran very often. The last time was in May. I visited some areas in northern Iran where the north-south corridor from Russia through Iran and India, and the infrastructure, despite 800 types of sanctions for 40 years, Iran has managed actually to develop a domestic construction capability. You have railways, you have roads, highways, ports. They are not top modern, but they are efficient for Iran. If the sanctions are lifted, then Iran's economy will explode because you have enormous talent. Iran is one of the leading nations in the education of the STEM, the science, technology, engineering, and 70% of them are women. So much to the rights of women in Iran. I mean, people have not met Iranian professional females. They're really tough. But so the idea is that with the abolition of the JCPOA and the imposition of more harsh, extreme sanctions on Iran, made it sure that we end up with having this confrontation. And this is where the issue is. But that's where, and as I said earlier, the real issue here is that there is an emerging global order by nations in the global south, spearheaded by China, and the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRICS grouping, which is growing, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization are the key cornerstones of this new system. And Iran is inside each of them. Especially in the past few years, Iran has become more and more integrated into the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRICS, and in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And this is where really, we have 200 years of British geopolitics, the great game. If I may, just to go a bit back to the history so people get to the point where I'm getting at. Because for more than 200 years, we had the great game. We had the so-called, Halford Mackinder's, the heartland and the rimland, is that whoever controls the pivot in Asia, that's Central Asia, Afghanistan, Central Asia, part of Iran, will control Eurasia and the world island. So the British they waged the great game against the Tsarist Russia already in the 18th century. And they were playing intelligence games in Central Asia and in Afghanistan. They invaded Afghanistan several times. They never conquered it. But what happened in August 2021 with the US, the humiliating US and NATO withdrawal from Afghanistan, is that 200 years of the great game were over. And the nations in Central Asia, and China was very quick to fill the vacuum by establishing diplomatic relations with the Taliban, and did a number of it. We have, of course, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which the Chinese are very strongly, backing it, despite terrorist attacks on the engineers, and so this is an existential issue. But on the other side, China dramatically increased its investments in Xinjiang province. In 2023, China invested $70 billion, the equivalent of $70 billion in industrial, technological, and infrastructure projects in Xinjiang, because Xinjiang now becomes not only a bridge to Eurasia, but becomes the hub, the heart of the economic cooperation, all Eurasia. And then we had China and the Central Asian countries consolidated their relations, and now we have major investments, but jointly by China and the Central Asian governments, like the China-Kyrgyzstan-Uzbekistan Railway, which was a big obstacle for opening up China to Central Asia. We have other projects with Kazakhstan, and China and Russia are now finally, since the February 2022 strategic agreement between China and Russia, they are aligning their strategic interests, including in this region, because there was this talk about Russia, this is Russia's backyard, China should not be there, but now that's over. So China, Russia, Central Asia, Afghanistan, and Iran are creating a landmass of economic cooperation and trade and technology transfer, which is very difficult to penetrate with intelligence games, with so-called NGOs, all kinds of military or intelligence operations. And this is really frustrating for the people behind this geopolitical old game. And therefore, this whole landmass, and therefore Iran is very pivotal in this whole constellation. But also it has a moderating effect on India, because India and Iran and Russia have a very good relationship, and India has interest in Afghanistan and Central Asia. It can only serve it through Iran. I don't see that's a contradiction with China's plans. I mean, if India builds railways, China will put its goods on them, on the trains. This zero-sum game, this mentality of the zero-sum game, that if somebody becomes wealthy, we get poor. This exists only in the West. I don't think it exists in the East, because in the East, the idea is that everybody can become wealthier and prosperous, and that will be feeding each other's progress. And I think this is one of the issues now, that the strategists in the West see Iran and Afghanistan, Pakistan, Central Asia, that they are losing this area, which they had actually dominance for many, it's like for centuries, if not directly, indirectly through destabilization operations. So this is really the background to what is going on now. If you remember, in 2022, President Xi Jinping was in the Gulf, and here is the Gulf countries are very key to this new strategy, because the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, especially, and also we have Egypt, they are moving east, both in cooperation with China along the Belt and Road, but also with Russia, and they want to use their oil revenues, the sovereign wealth funds, to develop industrial economies, and they see China as a key partner in this process. So President Xi Jinping was in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia in December 2022 and held 3 summits, one with the Saudi king, one with the Gulf Cooperation Council, and one with all the Arab countries. And he offered a number of very interesting agreements to cooperate in not only infrastructure, but also in information technology, AI, space technology, and nuclear power. So he offered the whole, and then of course we have this tendency to use local currencies in trade. This region is China's, China is all the countries in West Asia's main trade partner. It has taken over the EU and the United States in terms of the volume of trade with those countries, like surpassed them with big. And a few months, 2 months later, the Iranian president went to Beijing in 2023, President Raisi, and signed the comprehensive strategic agreement with China, which is for 25 years of exchanging oil for technology and infrastructure. People say it was a $400 billion deal. And then immediately after that, China managed to get Saudi Arabia and Iran to normalize relations again after about 8 years of proxy war, really bloody situation, which affected Yemen, affected the whole region. And that was a breakthrough for China, but also for the countries of the region to end these proxy wars. And immediately after that, you have President Biden announcing the India Middle East EU corridor, which is a bluff. It's a political bluff. It was intended to sabotage this whole new normalization in the region and bringing economic cooperation as the way to establish peace. Rather than peace through strength, you can have peace through economic cooperation. And then Netanyahu took this to the UN in September 2024, and he showed this whole, India, the Middle East, EU corridor as the alternative. He's called it the blessing, while Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon are in the curse region in black. And therefore, this is very clear an attack on the emergence of the Belt and Road as a new strategy for peace and economic development in the region, but also the inclusion of all these countries, except Israel, into the BRICS, into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and other interesting structures. So this is really what is behind this whole situation.
Now, I should remind viewers that Hussein's actually provided us with a much longer analysis of this backdrop in a recent podcast, and the details of that will be in the video description below, where there are maps and diagrams which really help people fill in the picture, because when you're sometimes not as familiar with the geography, a lot of this can become a little bit discombobulating. Look, I wanted to touch on.
I wrote the book actually in 2017. I co-authored it with other colleagues in the Schiller Institute. It's called "Extending the New Silk Road to West Asia and Africa," which is like 270 pages with maps and diagrams and everything about the next 50 years of development in this region. I'm updating that in a second edition this summer.
Look, what I wanted to do before we wrap up was really push in part further back in history, purely as historical context and out of interest, but also then push into the future. Now, China and that part of the world, what we would call East Asia, of course, has had long-standing trade and commercial and cultural and diplomatic intercourse with the ancient Persian empires. And in many regards, some of the things that we've been talking about is really about rejuvenating a lot of those historical links, or at least drawing inspiration from those historical links. And I'd like to sort of just fill in that long history, if we may, but not take too long doing it, because I'd really like you then to bring our minds back to the present and project it into the future in terms of where the possibilities are, but where, in the context of this set of unresolved root cause problems, we may face pitfalls and risks going forward.
Yes, I think one of the fascinating things I saw when President Xi Jinping announced the economic belt of the new Silk Road in Kazakhstan, in Astana. He reminded people of the caravans of the ancient Silk Road. It was a quite poetic speech, actually. And the history of the Silk Road is very, very fascinating, because it pertains not simply to economic gains, but to civilizational gains. Because one of the most important goods along the Silk Road, the ancient Silk Road, was not silk and spices. It was science, technology, philosophy, and paper. When the Arabs learned, there was in 750, as the Muslim empire was expanding from Baghdad eastward, it clashed with the Tang dynasty in a major battle somewhere near Kyrgyzstan today. But after that battle, the Tang dynasty and the Abbasid Caliphate actually established diplomatic relations, and it lasted for hundreds of years. And there were enormous exchanges of, science, technology, and even philosophical. But when the Arabs learned to make paper on an industrial scale, we had enormous activity of translation in Baghdad and intellectual production during the Islamic Renaissance. But there wasn't enough material to use to proliferate that knowledge. So when Arabs learned, and the Muslims and the Persians, of course, included in that, they learned to make paper, we had a revolution in the dissemination of knowledge and science and technology and medicine and all these things all over the area where the Muslim empire is expanding, including into Europe. So a lot of the knowledge, which was actually buried from the Greek civilization, was preserved through this by the Arabs and then rendered back to the Europeans later. So this is what is fascinating about the Silk Road. When you have nations working together in this idea of win-win. Now, this is what we are missing in the West here, because there is no idea of win-win. Here is the zero-sum game. The winner takes it all. You have to undermine your rivals. And this goes back to, of course, to the colonial period, where there's rivalry and competition over the trophies, because they think trophies are material goods, gold, silver, spices, trade, weapons, and that stuff. But the real trophy is knowledge and science and culture and music and all these things, which enriches society and makes it more productive. This is what our people here don't really understand, how important the new Silk Road, both the ancient and the modern ones, are. And this is what, when China revived this through the Belt and Road Initiative, and of course added to it the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, and the Global Civilization Initiative, because it's a one complete whole. You have economic cooperation, you have security cooperation, you have cultural cooperation, and scientific cooperation. And this way, all nations can rise together, and each can contribute from their background into this whole pool of knowledge and technology and prosperity. And also, of course, each nation have their own so-called comparative advantages, human resources or natural resources, geographical resources, and they can contribute and excel in one part of this whole process. So you can have a community of shared interests. The Chinese call it shared future. This is what it means. This is where we should be heading. And this is what today is really the test. Can we achieve such a level of human understanding and ability to realize that my prosperity is in the prosperity of the other, that my security is in the security of the other? This is what we need, a new security architecture where everybody's security is taken into consideration, because you cannot have this split situation where somebody can secure themselves with nuclear weapons and then the others are left to suffer the consequences of this insane geopolitical system. So I think this idea of the Silk Road, both the ancient Silk Road and the Belt and Road, this is what it really signifies.
So looking forward, as you start to think about updating your book, what are the 3 or 4 most important things that stand out for you as you map your own roadmap to reflect on the recent past, obviously the events of today, but to, I guess, point some ways towards the future where some of the things you've just talked about could be addressed, but in the context of the root cause problems that we discussed at the very outset of today's conversation?
Yeah, I think the most important thing which I have learned, and I'm grateful to my work with the Schiller Institute, because it's a cultural institution too, not only learning economics and history, but it's also a cultural. So, what is the nature of human beings, and what is the nature of our relationship to other human beings and our relationship to nature. Now, what this distinguishes us from every other creature except humans, animals, bacteria, is our ability to be creative, that we can discover new principles in the universe and utilize them to change our not only our view of the world, but our living standards through technology and improve everything around us by building infrastructure, building houses, purifying water, and looking to explore the universe. This is what really special about human beings. And if we have societies built on this idea of man and woman, as creative being, as born good, that we are born good and our intention is to do good in the world. It's like in the Old Testament, multiply and be productive and fill earth. This idea of man as a creative being, that's what it means to be created in the image of God, the creator. Now, many people have forgotten about that. They think they are the chosen people by God, but the other people are not chosen by God. But this is universal. This is what is really universal. It's not our cultural or social structures or political structure. What is universal is our character as creative beings in the universe, and that we can improve the universe around us. And there are no limited resources to fight over, because with our creativity, with our scientific technological progress, we can create new resources instead of fighting over the existing resources we had, because we moved away from burning wood to burning coal to oil and gas to uranium, and maybe in the future we have fusion power. So there are no limits to our creativity, but the important thing is that can we share that with others? Is this something which is characteristic of all human beings? And I think this is very key. And to understand economics, the way I understand economics, and as my teacher, Lyndon LaRouche, understands economics, is this: our ability to discover and invent and create. This is the most important aspect to learn about economy. And there are no limit. We are not bounded by limited natural resources. We are bounded by the limits of our knowledge. And if we have societies that develop this characteristic inside each human being through education, both scientific education, but also aesthetic education through poetry, language, music, art, then we can extrapolate that to relations among nations too, because it's in our interest, because we want to develop our individuals in our society this way. We want to live with other communities who do the same, and we can share this with other communities. And this is really the true meaning of a community of shared future for mankind, because we need to reach some universal idea, not universal in the terms of lawmaking. It's like building structures, universal political structures. No, universality in the sense of our identity as human beings in nature. And I think this is, I find it interesting that in Asia, people think in these terms, and not only in China with the Global Civilization Initiative. We have in Malaysia, the Prime Minister, Anwar Ibrahim, he has also a concept of tamaddun, that real progress is not only economic and technological progress, but it's cultural and spiritual progress. So we don't lose track of who we are on this planet. And I think this is very, very important to point out when we discuss how to solve these problems we have, like in West Asia and Middle East, in Ukraine and other people. If we see the others as human beings like we are, but then we know what does it mean to be human, then we can solve the problems on that level.
Well, on that note, Hussein Askari, thank you very much for bringing your personal perspectives as well as your professional expertise to shed some light on what's going on in Iran and West Asia generally, and to help us, I hope, better understand not only why we're at where we're at today, but perhaps outline also some pathways to a more constructive future. So once again, thank you very much for coming on the show, and I hope to have you back on again in the not too distant future.
Thank you very much for inviting me and giving me all the time to say the things I wanted to say.
If you like that video, Please like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps the channel. If you'd like to see more from TIO, check out the Substack link. Or if you'd like to see more from me, check out my Substack in the description.